Poems on the Underground is probably best known to the majority of those who know it at all, primarily as a book, 100 Poems on the Underground, which first appeared in 1991 and is now sitting in a good second-hand bookshop near you. In reality, as everyone quickly deduces and or learns on a visit to the British capital, it's also a project. It began in 1986 and it's still going strong. The founders, Gerard Benson, Judith Chernaik and Cicely Herbert, explained its genesis in their introduction to the book. It began, they wrote, as an idea shared among a few friends. How pleasant it would be, we thought, to read a few lines by one's favourite poet on the tube, instead of advertisements for Temps or toothpaste. We were Londoners by birth or adoption, habitual users of public transport, lovers of poetry. The Underground, also an inescapable part of our common life, had large numbers of empty advertising spaces. It seemed an entirely reasonable idea to propose filling the blank grey slots with poems for the entertainment of the travelling public. London Underground was surprisingly responsive to our suggestion. On the 29th of January 1986, the project was officially launched at Aldwych Station. A clutch of poets gathered in the rain, then descended 170 feet to the platform. Official party fare was coffee and donuts, but wine flowed too. And when the train bearing its consignment of poems arrived, 20 minutes late, we all climbed aboard, pursued by representatives of the press, radio and television. Within minutes, the carriages were alive to the sounds of happy poets declaiming verse by Shelley, Burns, and of course by themselves. The whole thing sounds very genteel, very English. I like to think that coffee and donuts was an attempt to mitigate that with something vaguely American. Had it been tea and biscuits, the Englishness would probably have achieved system overload. Had it been tea and scones, say, in the presence of a vicar, there would probably have been an explosion. Anyway, preference was given to poems about London, or by Londoners, but it was, and still is, open to new poets and international voices. Aldwych Underground Station sadly closed 2 years after the launch, but the project continues to grow. It inspired similar ventures in New York and Paris. In New York, it's called Poetry in Motion, and it premiered in 1992. The Paris version began in 2014, although an earlier version was trialled in 2011, and it's essentially a competition open to members of the public. The 2025 British collection includes poems by the Nigerian Nii Osundare, the Indian Sujata Bhatt, the Scot Niall Campbell, as well as the Anglo-born Lewis Corrie. As for the 1991 book, poetry anthologies can disappoint, but it's an excellent mix of old and new, British and wider world. It's now in its 9th edition, having sold over 250,000 copies, and it contains 258 poems. I'd like to speak personally for a minute or so, if that's okay, so you can switch off if you like. This entire project was founded on quite modest principles. How pleasant it would be, we thought, to read a few lines by one's favourite poet on the tube. Perhaps that was the only way to sell it to the powers that be, but probably considered good poetry is subversive. If Poems on the Underground had happened in 1960s Paris, it would have involved illegal bill posting and have been carried out by situationists. Imagine you're holding onto the overhead rail in a weary attempt to stop yourself bumping into everyone else. You look up, expecting an advert for a medication or trainers, and you see, that is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain. The happy highways where I went and cannot come again. Which might be enough to make a commuter cry, and maybe rethink his or her trajectory. Poetry is subversive. Capitalism bent rock music to its will sometime at the end of the 1960s. Poetry is the one art form it seems unable to turn a profit on. The introduction to 100 Poems on the Underground says, England is a nation of poetry lovers. Hundreds of people wrote in with queries about particular poems, suggestions of their own, and comments. Many letters just said in effect, thank you, whoever you are, for the poems. Nice. So perhaps there's a fount of frustration waiting to be unlocked. There may be a connection here to psychogeography. In his 2006 book on the subject, Merlin Coverley casts doubt on the movement's situationist origins, while emphasising its mystical disruptive potential. But nothing has more mystical stroke disruptive energy than poetry. We need more poets, who might also be billposters, modern-day Banksys perhaps, but Banksys of the pen. 21st century Blakes, Shelleys, Baudelaires, Wheatleys, Yeatses, Rimbos, De Primas. There's a misconception that good poetry is chiefly about scan and rhyme. It isn't. What all good poetry has in common is that it says something about something else in words that intuitively seem to fit, but which have never been used quite like that before. By virtue of its originality, a poem opens your eyes. To the extent that it doesn't do that, all the scan and rhyme in the world won't save it. When it does do that, it has the power to shake the world. Poetry on the underground was and is great. What we need now is poetry on the overground. Anyway, that was my 2 cents worth. Over and out.